Lesson 10, The Divided Monarchy, the Kingdoms of Israel and Judah, in the 9th century B.C. Now, first of all, we need to get some idea of what is happening in the vicinity. So let's talk about Mesopotamia first of all. Adad-nirari conducted 8 campaigns against the Arameans in Hanigalbat. His son, Tiglath-Ninurta III, covered the same territory, but he made vassals of their rulers. Most of the small states gave their tribute on demand. And we have Ashurnasirpal. He's said to be the founder of the early Assyrian Empire. Most of the evidence comes from the ruins of his palace at the biblical Calah. The Bible says that Nimrod began his rule at Babylon and then went to Assyria and built Nineveh and Calah. It was Ashurbanipal who made a small village into a magnificent city. His chief god was Ninurta, the god of war. He had a huge temple and ziggurat erected for the worship of Ninurta. By this, he signified that his political agenda would be relentless warfare in the quest for plunder and tribute. Excavations in the 19th and mid-20th centuries at Calah have made it one of the richest sites in Mesopotamia. The building of Calah was aided by military campaigns. He had at least one campaign a year in which he brought back quantities of plunder and large numbers of captives who were used in the workforce for building the new capital. Any people who rebelled were dealt with rapidly and cruelly. Cities were burned to the ground, and their leaders were horribly mutilated before being murdered. Finally, Ashurbanipal II turned his attention to the south via the Orontes Valley into central Syria. He washed his weapons in the Mediterranean Sea. The coastal cities saw this as an opportunity to open up markets in the east. Then came Shalmaneser III. The policies of his father were carried on by his son. The Assyrian threat forced the states of the central and southern Levant to work together. However, his own local conflicts and rivalries did not disappear during the 9th century. Most of his early campaigns were against states to his south and west. He also washed his weapons and made sacrifices to his god at the Mediterranean Sea. Egypt didn't have much going on at this time. There was no further military activity on the part of Egypt after the campaign of Shoshank. Each pharaoh had to keep his own territory intact. Then along the Phoenician coast, they chose to pay tribute to the Assyrian kings whenever it was demanded. They preferred to protect their commercial interests between the Mediterranean and inland Western Asia. Shishak's campaign, and this is where it involves Judah and Israel. Topographical list is preserved in the Ammon Temple in Karnak. His main objectives of the campaign were the kingdom of Israel and the Negev of Judah. Shishak used the logical and continuous route. He captured all the fortified towns on the main roads to Jerusalem between Gezer and Gibeon. His campaign was directed against both Judah and Israel for the purpose of strengthening the Egyptian domination of Philistia, while winning control of Jerusalem via Beit Horon. But after accepting a heavy tribute from Rehoboam, he turned northward and invaded the kingdom of Israel. He invaded Israel along the principal mountain highway. After conquering Tirzah and Penuel, Jeroboam's new capital, he moved northward up the Jordan Valley until he reached Beit Shan. The plain probably alludes to the valley of Beit Shan. From there he turned west to the valley of Jezreel, and from Megiddo he returned via Wadi Ara to the Sharon. Then he headed south along the Via Maris. This part of the campaign was aimed at seizing control over the Via Maris in the Jezreel Valley and the Sharon, while weakening the two kingdoms of Israel and Judah. Now the Negev settlements, only the detailed roster of towns in the Negev in the biblical lists pertain mostly to towns in the northern Negev, while Shishak concentrated his activities in the southern Negev. At the same time, his battalions marched deep into the expanses of the Judean Negev and apparently reached even to Etzion-Geber. The international commerce with South Arabia via Elat and the Negev, which had developed during Solomon's reign, was doubtless a thorn in Pharaoh's flesh. The Negev invasion was intended first and foremost to cut off these trade routes. Apparently, this goal was achieved, at least for a while, and the last remnants of control over Edom were snatched from Judean hands. The excavations at Etzion-Geber proved that the Solomonic fort had been destroyed, and over it a new fortification was built in the 9th century, evidently during the reign of Asa or Jehoshaphat. Now in the southern Levant, and this is what he was mostly interested in, the house of Jeroboam and Baasha is dominant. Israel consisted of all the northern tribes, the house of Joseph, the tribes of Galilee, and Transjordan. Judah, on the other hand, consisted of Judah, Simeon, and Benjamin, which now identified itself with Judah because of its association with Jerusalem. During the reigns of Rehoboam and Jeroboam, there were increasing war over the disputed portions of Benjamin. Jeroboam established his first capital at Shechem and built Penuel. This may be a hint of emergency in Transjordan. Abijah, son of Rehoboam, took Bethel, Jeshanah, and Ephraim and their villages from Jeroboam. Baasha overpowered Asa and drove southward to Ramah of Benjamin. This was just 5 miles from Jerusalem. Asa turned to Ben-Hadad and regained some of the territory, but Bethel remained Israelite. Josiah extended the boundary northward to include all Samaria. Now we have the Omride dynasty with Omri and Ahab, and there is internal political struggle as a result. Elah, son of Baasha, succeeded his father in the 26th year of Asa, according to the non-accession system being used in Israel. Now I need to explain this non-accession and the accession year dating. If a king, say for instance As an example, in the United States, our president receives the oath of office on the 20th of January, and that begins his reign. The non-accession year is that a king would begin his reign on the first day of the new year. But what if the previous king died, say, in August? Well, would you count the time from August to the first of the year? No, you would leave that, and you would not count his reign until the beginning of the new year. But in the southern kingdom, they had the accession year formula. That is, that whenever the king began, he counted that time from the time he took the office until the beginning of the new year, and that was considered year 1. And then at the new year, he began year 2. So this is why it is so difficult to harmonize the chronology between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, is that they are using different systems of counting the years of the kings. The official reign of 2 years for Baasha was therefore only 1 real year. He liked to eat and drink. Zimri, leader of half his chariot forces, killed him. Omri led a force to Tirzah, and Zimri committed suicide by burning the palace down over his head. A struggle between Omri and Tibni took place. Omri prevailed, and Tibni died. The inaugural passage makes it clear that this internal conflict lasted for 5 actual years. The conflict began in 885, Asa's 25th actual year, the Ascension system, and ended in 880 BC. Omri purchased the hill of Samaria. Both Shemer and Omri may be linked to the tribe of Issachar, and Omri might have been acting as the redeemer of clan territory. In any case, the new city would be royal property by purchase. The capital was moved from Tirzah to Samaria, an excellent strategic position on a high and isolated hill in Mount Ephraim, 7 miles southwest of Shechem. Samaria dominated the western approaches to the hill country, and it became the chief rival of Jerusalem. It gave its name to the whole area, replacing the former Mount Ephraim. So the name of the city, Samaria, became used for the name of the whole area. There are some political alliances that took place. A treaty was made with Tyre. This is between Samaria and Tyre. Evidence of this treaty is the marriage of Jezebel, daughter of Ithelbaal, king of Tyre, with Ahab, the son of Omri. There was also a political alliance with Judah. Athaliah, the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel, married Jehoram, the son of Jehoshaphat. Omri oppressed Moab and seized Medeba. This gave him a town on the north-south highway and the extensive agricultural resources that surrounded it. Israel occupied it for 40 years until the time of Mesha. Ahab succeeded his father and ushered in one of the worst periods of monarchical abuse in the history of ancient Israel. The introduction of Baal worship in Samaria, it was a financial as well as a religious institution and represented the close ties between the kingdoms of Tyre and Israel. A 3-year drought took place, and this was instigated by Elijah the prophet. About 856, war broke out between Israel and Damascus. In the first encounter, Israel was victorious. The king of Damascus reorganized his federal politics. He replaced his vassal kings by governors and raised a new army. They fought in a different venue. The site of Aphek, where it was fought, is not determined. Israel was again the victor. Ahab is rebuked by a prophet because he gave generous terms to the defeated king. From this battle comes the phrase that Yahweh is God of the hills and the valleys. Rehoboam's fortresses included several towns. We know that he fortified many towns in order to protect Jerusalem. The one group is Hebron, Bethkar, and Bethlehem. It's on the main highway down the ridge of the Judean hills. And then another group was Etam, Tekoa, and Ziph. It protected the approaches from the wilderness of Judah. And Adaraim, Adullam, and Soko, these were the routes to the Shephelah. Then Lachish, Maashah, and Gath in the south, Azekah, Zobah, and Ayalon in the north, along the western boundary with Philistia. Now let's talk about Shalmaneser III and the southern coalition. The part of the campaign of Shalmaneser III that interests us is the battle at Karkar. This is his confrontation with combined forces of coalition of states in the central and southern Levant. Although the source says that there were 12 members in the coalition, the actual number seems to be 11. There seems to be an exaggeration in the number of chariots and troops from most of the members. At the head of the list is Hadad Idri of Damascus. Second is Irhuleni the Hamathite, who stood in the most immediate danger. His territories had already suffered Assyrian aggression. It may have been the traditional friendship between Hamath and Israel going back to the time of David that brought Ahab into the conflict. Next come 3 entries of Gentiles without personal names, and then a number of Phoenician cities north of Byblos. The next to last mentioned is Gindibu, who contributed a camel corps. He was probably from North Africa. There are others that are mentioned which I have not named. Shalmaneser's account gave a mighty victory for the Assyrians. He says, "They attacked in order to make combat against me. With the overwhelming forces that Ashur, my lord, had given to me, with the mighty weapons that the divine standard that goes before me had granted me, I engaged them." Then he tells of the slaughter of the enemy. In reality, it was a stalemate. For the next 3 years, Shalmaneser did not cross the Euphrates River. Then there's also a problem with Moab. Moab was conquered under Omri, and his line of demarcation between Israel and Moab remained north of Dibon. The rebellion came on the death of Ahab, that is, when Moab rebelled against Israel. Mesha gained control over Medeba and built Baal Maon, the biblical Bath Baal Maon, today Ma'in in southwest of Medeba, and Kiriathaim, the biblical Kiriathaim. The conquest of Atarot, originally settled by Gad and built by the king of Israel as a fortified town on the border with Moab. The conquest of Nebo, the Israelite town near Mount Nebo, northwest of Medeba. Then the conquest of Jahaz, a fortified town on the fringe of the desert. Now, we may say a little bit more about the Mesha inscription in the next lesson, but these are the towns that he captured and rebelled against the king of Israel. The house of Jehu and the last days of the Israelite kingdom. Shalmaneser III advanced to a mountain by the name of Belirasi, the Carmel headland. From here, Shalmaneser turned and followed the line of the Phoenician coast to the mouth of Nahar el-Kab in the Lebanon region, where he had another relief inscribed. In the latter part of Jehu's reign and that of his son Jehoahaz, Israel suffered an unprecedented decline, its territory actually being reduced to the confines of Mount Ephraim. Hazael gained control over all of Israelite Transjordan. Eventually he took most of Galilee and the important valleys. According to an edition of the Septuagint, Hazael took all of Philistia from the sea to Aphek. Assyria later, near the end of the 9th century, relieved Israel by its pressure on Damascus. Joash, the son of Jehoahaz, defeated Ben-Hadad, the son of Hazael, 3 times. Jeroboam II, son of Joash, extended the border northward and eastward, including the entire length of the King's Highway in Transjordan, from the border of Edom to that of Hamath. Amaziah of Judah defeated the Edomites in the Valley of Salt. Uzziah extended the borders to their greatest extent. There were good relations between Israel and Judah during the reigns of Jeroboam II and Uzziah. Tiglath-Pileser III, his campaign and the fall of Samaria. He began the permanent absorption of territories by converting them into provinces. In the year 734, there was an expedition against Philistia, the conquest of Gaza, and seizure of the brook of Egypt. In year 733, expedition against Israel, conquest of Galilee, Gilead, and the coastal regions, which were reorganized into Assyrian provinces. The towns which can be identified with any degree of certainty were located in Galilee. Merom and Yaron, modern Yarun, in Upper Galilee. Hanathon, which is Tel El Batoth, in Lower Galilee. He organized 3 provinces that are named in the Assyrian lists according to their respective capitals. There's the province of Megiddo, which included Galilee and the northern plains, and the province of Dor, comprising the Sharon plain as far as the Philistine border, and the province of Gilead, all of the Israelite Transjordan. In the year 732, there's the conquest of Damascus and the land of Aram He exiled part of its population and reorganized its kingdom into an Assyrian province. Then the year 724, Shalmaneser moved against Samaria. In the years 722, 721, Sargon II captured Samaria after a 3-year siege. In the years 713 to 712, a new rebellion in Palestine. Ashdod, with support of Shabako, the founder of the 25th Egyptian dynasty in Egypt. Sargon captured Ashdod, Gath, Gibbethon, and Ekron. A few comments about Judah. We'll say much more about Judah in the next lesson. Hezekiah benefited in an increase in commerce in spite of the military activity. And then concerning temples during the reign of Hezekiah. There are 3 cities which dominated the border region: Arad, Beersheba, and Lachish. Amos was the first to denounce them. Hezekiah limited their function by centralizing the offering of sacrifices in Jerusalem. Josiah completed the reform by abolishing all cult places outside Jerusalem. One of his main ambitions had been the abolition of the Bethel temple, which sanctified the border separating Israel from Judah.